Imagine darkness. Not the simple absence of light that comes when you close your eyes, but the profound, absolute darkness that exists beneath countless tons of stone and metal, in chambers that have known no illumination for millions of years. In this darkness, two very different forms of sleep converge. One is the manufactured hibernation of an ancient Xenos race, their bodies transformed into living metal, waiting in stasis for the galaxy to become ripe for reconquest. The other is the forced slumber of a space marine hero, his broken body encased in a walking tomb, kept alive by machines that blur the line between flesh and steel. What happens when these two forms of eternal service meet? When the ancient sensors of a Necron tomb world detect something that should not exist within their sacred halls? When beings who were once mortal, now immortal through technology, encounter a warrior who hovers in that terrible space between life and death? This is not a simple story of discovery. It is a tale that touches on the fundamental nature of existence in the 41st millennium, where duty transcends death and service, continues long past the point where it should mercifully end. It is about the collision of two impossibilities, two different answers to the same question: how do you preserve what matters when the flesh fails? The Necrons understand this question intimately. 60 million years ago, they made their choice. They traded cancer, riddled flesh for deathless metal, traded their souls for the promise of eternal life. Every Necron who awakens from the great sleep carries with them the weight of that bargain, the memory of what they lost in exchange for what they gained. Some retain enough consciousness to regret it. Others have degraded into little more than automatons, their personalities eroded by countless cycles of death and reanimation. The Space Marine in his Dreadnought sarcophagus faces a different kind of eternity. He was not given a choice, not really. When his body was shattered beyond even the considerable abilities of his chapter's apothecaries to repair, the decision was made for him. The alternative was death, and Space Marines do not surrender easily to that final darkness. So he was interred, his ruined form connected to machines that would keep the spark of life burning within his broken flesh. His consciousness linked to the massive war machine that would become his new body, in a tomb buried beneath kilometers of bedrock, on a world whose name has been forgotten by all, but the most ancient of records. These two kinds of sleepers are about to meet. The encounter will raise questions that neither side is fully equipped to answer. Questions about consciousness and identity, about the value of organic life versus mechanical existence, about whether either of these beings can truly be called alive in any meaningful sense. Let us descend into those lightless depths and witness what unfolds when the ancient and the merely old collide. The nature of the Dreadnought. To understand what the Necrons will find, we must first understand what a Space Marine Dreadnought truly is. To the uninitiated observer, a Dreadnought appears to be simply a walking tank, a bipedal war machine that strides across the battlefield dispensing death with an array of heavy weapons. But this surface understanding misses the profound tragedy and horror that lies at the heart of every Dreadnought's existence. The process begins with catastrophic injury. Not just any wound will suffice for interment within a Dreadnought. The Space Marine in question must be so thoroughly broken that even the advanced medical technology of the Imperium cannot restore him to functional combat effectiveness. We are talking about injuries that would kill a normal human instantly and multiple times over. Spines shattered into fragments, limbs torn away, internal organs crushed or destroyed, burns that char flesh down to the bone. The kind of devastation that makes mockery of the Space Marine's enhanced physiology and ability to survive. Yet, despite these horrific wounds, the spark of life must still remain. The Marine's brain must be intact enough to house consciousness. His gene seed must be preserved. And most importantly, his chapter must deem him worthy of the honor of continued service. For that is how it is presented to the grievously wounded warrior: an honor. A chance to continue fighting for the Emperor beyond the point where mortality would normally claim him. The reality is far darker than the ceremonial language suggests. The wounded Space Marine is brought to the chapter's Tech Marines and Master of the Forge. There, in chambers that smell of sacred oils and ozone. The lengthy process of interment begins. What remains of the Marine's body is carefully prepared. Limbs that serve no purpose are amputated. The torso is fitted with connection ports that will link directly to the Dreadnought's systems. The skull is modified to accept neural interface plugs. Throughout this process, the Marine hovers in a state somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, kept alive by machines but aware, on some level, of what is being done to him. Then comes the sarcophagus itself, the armored coffin that will become the Marine's entire world. Inside this cramped space, barely larger than the warrior's remaining body, he will spend the rest of his existence. The interior is filled with amniotic fluids, thick and cold like oil, which will sustain his flesh and fill his lungs as he breathes. Neural interface cables stab into his spine, his brain, connecting him to the Dreadnought's sensors and weapon systems. Life support mechanisms monitor every function of his remaining organs, adjusting chemicals and nutrients to keep the biological components alive. The sarcophagus is then sealed and integrated into the Dreadnought chassis. This massive war machine becomes the Marine's new body. Through the mind impulse unit, his thoughts control the Dreadnought's limbs. His visual cortex receives input from the machine's optical sensors. His hands, which no longer exist in any physical sense, feel the weight of weapons that could reduce buildings to rubble. He becomes something that is neither man nor machine, but a hybrid of both, each component unable to exist without the other. When the Dreadnought is not needed for battle, it is returned to the chapter's fortress monastery and placed in the sacred halls where these ancient warriors wait between deployments. The pilot is placed into a deep sleep, a form of stasis that slows his biological processes to almost nothing. This sleep serves multiple purposes. It preserves the limited lifespan of the organic components, extending the Marine's service by centuries or even millennia. It prevents the psychological degradation that would inevitably result from spending decades or centuries in sensory deprivation, sealed in darkness with nothing but one's thoughts for company. But this sleep is not the peaceful rest of natural slumber. It is a void, a nothingness that swallows time. The Marine enters sleep and then, in what feels like an instant, but might be years or decades later, awakens to the sounds of war. There are no dreams to mark the passage of time, no sense of rest or rejuvenation, just the abrupt transition from unconsciousness to awakening, often with no clear sense of how long has passed since the last time consciousness claimed him. Over time, this existence takes its toll. The human mind, even one enhanced and conditioned like a space marine's, was not meant for such fragmented existence. Memories begin to blur and fade. The face of battle, brothers who fought alongside the warrior in his flesh, and blood days become indistinct. The reasons for ancient grudges or honored friendships slip away like water through fingers. What remains is duty, the one constant that survives when all else has eroded away. Some Dreadnoughts, particularly the ancient ones who have served for thousands of years, retain remarkable clarity and wisdom. These venerable Dreadnoughts are treasured by their chapters, not just as powerful weapons, but as living links to the chapter's history, as advisors whose experience spans centuries of warfare. But even these ancient ones are changed by their long service. They speak with voices that crackle with mechanical interference, their words carrying the weight of ages. They move with purpose that suggests they have forgotten what it means to waste time or indulge in anything beyond the necessities of war. Others are less fortunate. The repeated cycles of sleep and awakening, the gradual decay of neural connections, the simple wearing down of organic tissue, despite the best efforts of the life support systems, all of these take their toll. Some Dreadnoughts become increasingly erratic, their personalities fragmenting under the strain of their existence. They wake screaming, or speaking to battle, brothers long dead, or expressing confusion about which war they have been awakened to fight. The Tech Marines do their best to maintain the pilots, but there are limits to what even their skills can accomplish. The voice that emanates from a Dreadnought is itself an eerie thing. The organic vocal cords of the pilot no longer function in any meaningful way, submerged as they are in the amniotic fluid of the sarcophagus. Instead, the Dreadnought's systems translate the pilot's attempt to speak into a synthesized voice, crackling with static and distortion. Every Dreadnought sounds slightly different. The particular timbre and quality of their mechanical voice, unique to that individual, but all share that same quality of wrongness. The audible evidence that you are not speaking to a living being in any conventional sense. Inside the sarcophagus, the Marine experiences existence in ways that would drive a normal human mad. His remaining senses, such as they are, feed him information that has been filtered and interpreted by the Dreadnought's machine spirit and sensor arrays. He sees through optical sensors that can switch between normal vision, thermal imaging, and targeting overlays. He hears through audio receptors that can filter out specific frequencies or amplify distant sounds. He feels not through nerve endings in skin, but through pressure sensors in the Dreadnought's armor plating and the feedback from its servo, motors, and hydraulic systems. When the Dreadnought moves, the pilot feels it not as the familiar sensation of muscles contracting and joints articulating, but as something alien and yet intimate. The fusion reactor that powers the war machine thrums, in a way he feels in what would be his bones, if he still had bones in any conventional sense. The targeting systems that track potential threats create a sensation somewhere between sight and intuition. A knowing where enemies are even when they are beyond the range of visual sensors. All of this is filtered through the constant awareness of his own body, or what remains of it. The Marine can, if he allows his attention to shift away from the Dreadnought systems, become aware of the amniotic fluid filling his lungs with each mechanical breath. He can feel the neural interface cables that pierce his flesh. He can sense the slow degradation of tissue that the life support systems work constantly to repair. This awareness is maddening, and so most pilots learn to focus entirely on the Dreadnought, to lose themselves in the machine and forget the broken remnants of flesh that technically still qualify them as living. The psychological impact of this existence cannot be overstated. Space Marines are conditioned from the moment of their recruitment to endure hardships that would shatter normal humans. They are trained to function through levels of pain and stress that most people cannot even comprehend. But the existence of a Dreadnought pilot pushes even these limits. It is not the acute suffering of battle that breaks them, but the chronic, unending nature of their half-life. The knowledge that there will be no retirement, no peaceful end, only an eternity of awakening to war, fighting, and returning to dreamless sleep until the next time they are needed. Some Dreadnoughts, when the end finally comes for them, meet destruction in battle with something approaching relief. They have served for centuries or millennia, witnessed the fall of enemies and the loss of brothers, outlived every Marine who might have remembered them as anything other than the ancient ones. Death, when it finally claims them, is not a defeat, but a release from an existence that had long since ceased to resemble anything that could be called life. This is what the Necrons are about to discover in their tomb. Not a simple machine of war, but a prison containing a consciousness that may have existed in this state for hundreds or even thousands of years. A being that shares, in its own way, the Necron's own experience of existence without life, of consciousness preserved at terrible cost, of service that continues long past the point where it should have ended. The architecture of eternal sleep, the Necron tomb world where our Dreadnought finds itself, is a monument to a civilization that chose to cheat death through the most drastic means imaginable. These structures, scattered across the galaxy like time, bombs waiting to detonate, represent the Necron's answer to mortality. To understand what happens when the tomb's denizens discover the Space Marine intruder, we must first understand the nature of these vast underground complexes. Necron tomb worlds are not built according to conventional architectural principles. The beings who designed them had mastered technologies that allow them to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself. Using their understanding of interdimensional geometry, the ancient Necrons created spaces that are larger on the inside than their external dimensions should allow, A chamber that might appear from the outside to be a simple vault the size of a small building can contain within it ranks upon ranks of stasis crypts, stretching away into a distance that should not physically fit within the available space. The construction of these tombs began over 60 million years before the current age, when the Necrons, then still the mortal Necronter, made their bargain with the Titan and underwent the process of biotransference. They knew that the galaxy was not yet ready for their domination. The psychic races created by the Old Ones still held too much power. The warp storms and dimensional instabilities caused by the war in heaven made the galaxy effectively uninhabitable. And so the Necrons, now transformed into mechanical bodies that would never age or decay, decided to wait. They burrowed deep into the worlds they had claimed, using their mastery of matter manipulation to hollow out vast spaces beneath the planetary crust. These were not simple caves or tunnels, but precisely engineered complexes designed to house entire civilizations in suspended animation. The primary tombs were placed at the hearts of these complexes, great halls filled with stasis crypts where the Necron nobility and their warriors would sleep away the ages. Around these central chambers, the tomb complexes spread in elaborate networks, power generation facilities that tap into the planetary core, drawing on geological forces to sustain the tomb systems for millions of years. Reanimation forges where damaged Necrons can be repaired or entirely rebuilt. Armories containing weapons and war machines, kept in perfect stasis against the day they would be needed again. Command centers where the tomb's automated defense systems and monitoring equipment could track the passage of time and conditions on the world's surface. All of this is built from materials that would seem impossible by the standards of lesser races. The living metal, called necrodermis, forms the structure of the tombs, capable of self, repair and resistant to all but the most extreme forms of damage. This same material makes up the bodies of the Necrons themselves, which explains their remarkable ability to reconstruct themselves after suffering injuries that would destroy any organic being. The tombs are not merely passive storage. They are actively maintained by armies of canoptek constructs, semi-autonomous machines designed to serve specific functions within the complex. Canoptek scarabs, small beetle-like machines the size of a human hand, swarm through the tombs in their millions. They perform the basic maintenance work, repairing damage to structures, maintaining the stasis systems, and consuming any foreign matter that might intrude into the sacred spaces. These scarabs are individually simple, barely more sophisticated than insects, but in vast swarms they can accomplish remarkable feats of construction and destruction. Larger canoptek constructs serve more specialized roles. The canoptek spiders are massive spider-like machines that oversee the work of the scarabs and handle more complex repair tasks. They can fabricate new scarabs as needed, drawing on raw materials stored within the tomb or harvested from the surrounding rock. Canoptek wraiths phase in and out of reality, patrolling the tomb's corridors and reacting to any threats that might disturb the slumbering Necrons. These wraiths are particularly unsettling, as they can move through solid matter as easily as air, making them nearly impossible to hide from or escape. Overseeing all of these autonomous systems is the Tom Mind, a vast computational intelligence that manages the tomb's awakening protocols and defense mechanisms. The Tome Mind is not truly sentient in the way that a Necron Lord or Overlord is, but it possesses a form of artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to make complex decisions based on changing circumstances. It constantly monitors conditions both within the tomb and on the world's surface, tracking everything from tectonic activity to the movement of any life forms that might pose a threat to the sleeping Necrons. The Tom Mind operates according to algorithms developed over millions of years of Necronter civilization, refined and perfected by crypteks before the Great Sleep began. These algorithms allow it to respond to threats in a graduated fashion. Minor disturbances, like small animals burrowing near the outer reaches of the tome, are dealt with by the automated defenses, usually scarab swarms that eliminate the intrusion with mechanical efficiency. Larger threats trigger more substantial responses, potentially including the awakening of Necron warriors or even more powerful units. But the Tom mind faces a limitation that will become crucial when it detects the Dreadnought. It can only respond to threats that fit within its programming. An attacking army, a natural disaster, the delving of primitive civilizations into the upper levels of the tomb. All of these fall within expected parameters. But the presence of a space marine Dreadnought, a piece of technology from a civilization that did not exist when the tomb's security protocols were designed, presents an anomaly. The Tom mind must categorize this intrusion, must determine whether it represents a threat requiring immediate response or simply an unusual bit of debris that has somehow found its way into the tome's depths. The awakening protocols themselves are graduated and methodical. The Necrons do not simply snap back to consciousness all at once. That would be inefficient and potentially dangerous, as it would drain the tome's accumulated power reserves and leave the dynasty vulnerable if the awakening was triggered by a false alarm. Instead, the process unfolds in carefully designed stages. First come the canoptic constructs, already active in their role as the tome's maintenance systems. They investigate any disturbance, gathering data about its nature and severity. If they determine that the threat cannot be handled by automated defenses alone, they trigger the next level of response, the awakening of the most basic Necron warriors. These warriors are the lowest tier of true Necrons, beings who possessed little enough consciousness, even before biotransference, that they have degraded into little more than automatons. They follow simple protocols, responding to threats with overwhelming firepower but minimal tactical sophistication. If the warriors prove insufficient, or if the nature of the threat suggests the need for more intelligent response, the awakening spreads upward through the hierarchy. Immortals, slightly more sophisticated than warriors, might be awakened next. These Necrons retain enough consciousness to adapt their tactics to changing battlefield conditions. Then come the specialist units, destroyers, Leichguard, the various war constructs that form the muscle of a Necron army. Only if the situation demands it are the nobles awakened, the lords and overlords who possess full consciousness and strategic intelligence. This graduated awakening serves multiple purposes. It conserves the tome's power reserves, which even with geothermal tapping are not infinite. It minimizes the risk of awakening damage, as each cycle of sleep and waking can potentially cause degradation to a Necron's consciousness matrix. And it ensures that the most valuable individuals, the nobility who still possess personalities and memories worth preserving, are not wasted on threats that lesser forces could handle. The process of awakening itself is not instantaneous. When the signal reaches a particular stasis crypt, systems that have remained dormant for thousands or millions of years begin to cycle up. Power flows through circuits that have known nothing but the faint trickle of maintenance current for ages beyond counting. The necrodermis body of the sleeping Necron begins to respond, living metal systems coming back online with the efficiency of machinery but the subtlety of organic awakening. For the Necron experiencing this awakening, the transition from stasis to consciousness varies depending on how much of their original personality survived biotransference and the countless cycles since then. Some, particularly the nobles, retain enough self-awareness to experience something like the disorientation of waking from deep sleep. They might take a moment to orient themselves, to remember where they are and why they sleep. Others, the degraded warriors and lesser Necrons, simply transition from off to on. Their consciousness too diminished to register the passage of time or the significance of their awakening. The tomb where our Dreadnought now rests has been sealed for a span of time that staggers human comprehension. This is not a recently awakened tomb world where the Necrons have begun to reclaim their ancient domains. This is an old tomb, one whose inhabitants have been undisturbed for so long that even the regular cycles of their awakening protocols have not been triggered in centuries or millennia. The world above might have changed beyond recognition, continents might have shifted, oceans might have formed or dried up, life might have evolved, flourished, and gone extinct multiple times over. In such an ancient tomb, The first systems to detect the Dreadnought's presence would be the passive sensors that monitor for seismic activity, energy signatures, and physical intrusions. These sensors have been functioning continuously since the tomb was sealed. Their power draw so minimal that they can operate essentially forever on the tomb's reserves. They feed their data to the tomb mind in a constant stream of information that, for millions of years, has shown nothing but the slow, predictable changes of geology and the occasional disturbance from the world's limited surface life. The detection of the Dreadnought would represent a dramatic departure from this pattern. Here is a massive object, metallic and manufactured, radiating energy signatures that clearly mark it as artificial. It has appeared, somehow, within the sacred precincts of the tomb itself, bypassing all the outer defenses and warning systems. The tomb mine's algorithms would immediately flag this as a high-priority anomaly requiring investigation. But investigation by what means? The location of the Dreadnought within the tomb would matter enormously. If it is in the outer corridors, relatively near to the surface, the canoptek scarabs and spiders could reach it easily. If it has penetrated deeper, perhaps carried by some ancient collapse of tunnels, or brought there by forces unknown, the investigation might require awakening more sophisticated systems, or even beginning the process of rousing actual Necrons from their sleep. The tomb mind would begin its analysis carefully, gathering data from every sensor it can bring to bear on the intruder. It would detect the Dreadnought's power source, the fusion reactor that provides the energy to keep the war machine and its organic pilot alive. This energy signature would be unlike anything in the tomb mine's ancient databanks. It is not the clean, efficient power generation of Necron technology, which taps into fundamental forces of the universe with near-perfect efficiency. It is crude by comparison, a brute force approach to generating energy that nevertheless works effectively enough to have kept the Dreadnought functioning potentially for centuries. The tomb mind would also detect life signs. This would be particularly puzzling. The entire purpose of the tomb is to house beings who have transcended biological life, who exist as consciousness patterns impressed into mechanical bodies. The presence of organic tissue, a beating heart however damaged, neural activity however limited, all of this would register as completely anomalous. Is this some new form of attack by the younger races? An attempt to infiltrate the tomb with a bioweapon? Or something else entirely? Something that does not fit any threat category in the ancient protocols? As the tomb mine's investigation continues, gathering more data about this strange intrusion, the decision point approaches. What protocol should be followed? How should the tomb respond to something that fits no known category of threat or intrusion? The answer to this question will determine the fate of the sleeping space marine and potentially trigger a series of events whose consequences ripple far beyond the confines of this single tomb. When immortals meet, the scenario of how a space marine dreadnought ends up deep within a Necron tomb world is crucial to understanding what happens next. This is not a simple matter of the dreadnought walking into the tomb's entrance. The security systems, the layers of defense, the sheer depth of these structures beneath the planetary surface all make such direct intrusion effectively impossible. Instead, we must consider scenarios that allow for the dreadnought's presence without triggering an immediate defensive response. The most plausible scenario involves a battle fought long ago on the world's surface, at a time when the Necrons below still slept and their tomb remained undiscovered. Space Marines engaged with some other enemy, perhaps Orcs or Chaos forces, or a Xenos threat now long forgotten. In the fury of that battle, a dreadnought was severely damaged. Not destroyed outright, which would have triggered the standard protocols for recovering the fallen, but damaged in a way that prevented immediate retrieval. Perhaps the dreadnought fell into a chasm, a natural formation, or one created by orbital bombardment or artillery fire. The war machine tumbled down into darkness, coming to rest in caverns far below the surface. The chapter searched for their ancient warrior, but the conditions of battle, the terrain, or the simple scale of the engagement made recovery impossible before they were forced to withdraw from the world. They departed, intending perhaps to return when conditions allowed. But the vagaries of war in the 41st millennium are such that return was never possible. The chapter moved on to other conflicts, other worlds. The Dreadnought was listed as lost, his name added to the rolls of the honored fallen. But the Dreadnought was not dead. His sarcophagus was damaged, certainly. Systems that had maintained him for centuries were compromised. But the fundamental life support, the core systems that kept the pilot's organic components alive, continued to function. Buried in the darkness, the Dreadnought went into a deeper form of stasis, its power reserves carefully managed by damaged but still operational systems. And there it lay for decades, perhaps centuries. During this time, the world's geology continued its slow work. The cavern where the Dreadnought rested was not isolated, but connected through fissures and ancient lava tubes to deeper chambers. Slowly, perhaps driven by seismic activity or the gradual settling of the rock, the Dreadnought shifted. Millimeter by millimeter, year by year, it descended through the layers of stone. What began hundreds of meters below the surface eventually reached the outer boundaries of the Necron tomb itself. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. The outer defenses of a Necron tomb are designed to respond to active threats, to entities attempting to breach the tomb with purpose and awareness. But the Dreadnought is not actively intruding. It is an inert object, moved by geological forces beyond anyone's control. When it finally breaks through into one of the tomb's outermost chambers, perhaps through a section of wall weakened by millions of years of slow crystallization, the tomb's defenses face a dilemma. The breach itself would immediately trigger alarms. A section of the tomb structure has been compromised, allowing the intrusion of foreign matter. Canoptek scarabs would swarm to the location, ready to repair the breach and eliminate any intruding material. But what they find is not simple rock or soil. It is a massive manufactured object, clearly artificial, made of materials that their limited programming cannot immediately categorize. The scarabs might attempt to disassemble the Dreadnought as they would any other foreign object, but they would quickly encounter resistance. The adamantium and ceramite armor of the Dreadnought, while not as sophisticated as necrodermis, is nevertheless extremely durable. The scarab's molecular disassembly tools, effective against rock and organic matter, make only slow progress against the Space Marine vehicle's hull. Moreover, as they begin their work, they trigger responses from the Dreadnought's own systems. Even in its dormant state, the Dreadnought retains automated defense protocols. When the scarabs begin cutting into the armor, sensor systems that have lain quiet for decades suddenly activate. Power flows to defensive systems. The Dreadnought might not fully awaken, its pilot still lost in the depths of stasis sleep, but the machine itself responds to the perceived threat. Electromagnetic pulses, or localized energy, discharges might scatter the scarab swarms, buying time before they can resume their work. This escalation would draw the attention of larger Canoptek constructs. A Canoptek spider, alerted by the inability of its scarabs to handle the intrusion, would approach to investigate. The spider possesses much more sophisticated analytical capabilities than the simple scarabs. It can scan the Dreadnought with sensors that operate across multiple spectra, building a detailed profile of the intruder. And this is where things become complex. The spider would detect the Dreadnought's power source, still functioning after all this time. It would map the outline of the war machine, recognizing patterns that suggest weapons systems and sensory apparatus. But most puzzling of all, it would detect life signs from within the central sarcophagus. Organic tissue, neural activity, a heartbeat. Something living exists inside this machine. Something that has somehow survived in this state for a span of time that the spider's dating systems would struggle to calculate precisely. This information would be transmitted to the tome mind, and here we reach the critical decision point. The tome mind must categorize this discovery according to its ancient protocols. Is this a threat? It carries weapons, certainly, but shows no hostile intent. Is it a form of debris? But debris does not maintain life signs or repair systems. Is it a probe or spy from the surface world? but its design and technological signature match nothing in the database of current or historical surface civilizations. The Tom Mind's response would depend partly on what level of the tomb the Dreadnought has reached and what resources are available to investigate further. If Canoptech constructs alone prove insufficient to analyze the intrusion, the Tom Mind might make the decision to awaken a cryptic, specifically a technomancer whose expertise lies in understanding and manipulating technology. This awakening would be momentous. The tomb has lain silent for so long that the very act of rousing one of its inhabitants represents a significant event. Power flows through circuits that have carried only maintenance current for ages. The stasis crypt containing the technomancer begins the sequence of awakening. The cryptic experiences the transition from the timeless void of stasis to consciousness, a process that even after millions of years of practice remains disorienting. The technomancer would receive the data compiled by the Canoptech constructs and the Tom Mind, studying the reports of this impossible intrusion. His first actions would be cautious. A cryptic survives for millions of years not through reckless action, but through careful analysis and methodical approach to problems. He would command the Canoptech constructs to establish a perimeter around the Dreadnought, preventing any further movement while allowing for detailed study. Approaching the Dreadnought himself, the technomancer would experience something few Necrons ever encounter: genuine curiosity. The younger races, the civilizations that have arisen during the Necrons' sleep, are generally beneath the notice of those who remember when the galaxy looked entirely different. But here is something different. Here is technology that, while crude by Necron standards, shows an approach to preserving life that parallels, in some ways, the Necrons' own choice of biotransference. The technomancer would begin his examination methodically. External scans first, mapping every detail of the Dreadnought's structure without yet attempting to breach its armor. The weapons systems would be of particular interest. Strange devices that appear to combine projectile and energy weapon technologies in ways that Necron weapons abandoned millions of years ago. The power source, a fusion reactor of significant output given its size, would be analyzed and compared to ancient Necron databases. The conclusion would be clear. This is the work of a relatively primitive civilization, but one that has achieved a level of sophistication far beyond mere stone tools and fire. But the truly fascinating discovery would be the sarcophagus and what it contains. The technomancer's sensors would penetrate the armor, revealing the chamber within. What he finds there would give even a being who has seen 60 million years of technological development pause for thought. Here is a space marine, or what remains of one, suspended in amniotic fluid and kept alive by machines that have fused with his flesh in ways that blur all boundaries between organic and artificial. The comparison to the Necron's own state would be inescapable. Here is another being whose existence depends entirely on technology, whose body has been modified beyond all natural limits, who sleeps between periods of active service. The differences are obvious. The Space Marine retains his organic components, while Necrons traded flesh for metal entirely. The Space Marine's preservation is individual and mechanical, while the Necrons' immortality stems from their transcendence of biology itself. But the similarities would be impossible for the technomancer to ignore. This discovery would present the technomancer with a decision that goes beyond simple threat assessment. What should be done with this find? The options would be numerous, each with its own implications. The cryptic's fascination. The technomancer stands in the darkened chamber, his emerald optical sensors casting a faint green glow across the battered surface of the Dreadnought. Around him, Canoptech scarabs drift in slow orbits, their repair protocols temporarily suspended awaiting his commands. The silence is absolute, except for the faint hum of the Dreadnought's systems, a sound that has not been heard in this tomb for millions of years, if ever. He extends one metallic hand, sensors in his fingertips activating as he touches the Dreadnought's hull. Data flows into his consciousness, information about the composition of the armor, its molecular structure, the traces of damage from battles long past. The technomancer processes this information with the ease of eons of practice, but underneath the clinical analysis runs a current of something that might, in an organic being, be called wonder. The materials are crude, yes, iron and ceramite adamantium alloys, nothing approaching the sophistication of necrodermis or the other exotic materials the Necrons employ. But within the limitations of these materials, the construction shows an understanding of structural dynamics and armor theory that is remarkably sophisticated. Whoever built this war machine understood the principles of dispersing impact force and channeling energy. They knew how to create a platform that could withstand tremendous punishment while protecting the precious cargo within. The weapons draw his attention next. The technomancer circles the Dreadnought slowly, studying each system in turn. An assault cannon, its multiple barrels designed for sustained high-rate fire. A power fist, crackling with barely contained energy, even in its dormant state. Perhaps a missile launcher or heavy bolter on the other arm, depending on the Dreadnought's configuration. Each weapon represents a solution to a specific tactical problem, designed to allow a single unit to engage multiple types of enemies effectively. Compared to Necron weaponry, these devices are almost comically primitive, where a Necron gas flayer strips away an enemy's atoms layer by layer with perfect efficiency. These projectile weapons rely on brute kinetic force and explosive reactions, where Necron particle weapons can phase targets out of reality or teleport them across the battlefield. These energy weapons simply heat and cut through their targets. But the technomancer recognizes the underlying sophistication even in primitive implementation. These are not the random assemblages of barely understood technology that some younger races employ. This is deliberate engineering by beings who understood the principles they were working with. But all of this, interesting as it might be from a purely academic standpoint, pales in comparison to what the technomancer's sensors reveal about the sarcophagus and its contents. He focuses his attention on the central chamber, employing scanning techniques that can see through armor and fluid alike to map every detail of what lies within. What he discovers there forces him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the younger race's approach to mortality. The space marine inside the sarcophagus is alive, in the strictest biological sense. His heart beats slowly but steadily. Neural activity flickers through his brain, maintaining the basic functions necessary for continued existence while higher consciousness remains dormant. The tissue shows signs of tremendous damage, old wounds that healed only partially before the marine was interred. But the life support systems maintain him, cycling nutrients and oxygen, removing waste products, keeping every component within parameters necessary for survival. The technomancer catalogues each system with growing fascination. The amniotic fluid that fills the sarcophagus is not simple water, but a complex chemical mixture, optimized to support tissue while preventing degradation. The neural interface cables that connect the marine to the Dreadnought systems represent an understanding of nervous system architecture that would be impressive even by Necron standards, though the implementation is crude compared to what a cryptic might accomplish. The life support monitors track hundreds of variables simultaneously, adjusting their outputs based on the organic component's changing needs. Here, then, is the younger race's answer to the problem of preserving consciousness beyond the limits of flesh. Not the wholesale abandonment of biology, as the Necrons chose, but a hybrid approach. Preserve the organic brain, the seat of consciousness and identity, while replacing the body with a mechanical shell that can continue to fight and serve even when the flesh has failed. The Space Marine exists in a state that is neither fully alive nor truly dead, suspended in a technological purgatory that bears uncomfortable similarities to the Necrons' own existence. The technomancer considers the age of the Dreadnought, analyzing decay rates and system wear to estimate how long it has been in operation. The results surprise even him. This particular Dreadnought is ancient by the standards of the Imperium, having served for perhaps 500 or even 1,000 years. The pilot within has spent the vast majority of that time in stasis, awakened only for brief periods of battle before being returned to dreamless sleep. In total, He has probably been conscious for only a few decades of that entire span, experiencing existence in fragmentary bursts, separated by voids of unconscious time. It is a pale imitation of the Necrons' own great sleep, lasting merely centuries instead of millions of years, but the principle is eerily similar. Both the Dreadnought pilot and the Necrons sleep to preserve themselves for future service. Both awaken only when duty calls. Both exist in states that cannot properly be called life, but equally cannot be called death. The technomancer wonders, with the portion of his consciousness that still retains the capacity for philosophical speculation, what dreams or thoughts occupy the space marine during his sleep? Does he experience the same timeless void that Necrons know, where consciousness simply ceases between one moment and the next? Or does some fragment of awareness persist, lost in formless darkness, marking the passage of time in ways that would drive an organic mind to madness? These questions matter because they touch on something the Necrons themselves have struggled with since biotransference. What is consciousness when divorced from organic substrate? Can identity persist when the medium that houses it has been so fundamentally altered? The Necron nobles, those who retained enough of their original personalities to still ask such questions, have debated these issues for millions of years without reaching satisfying conclusions. Many have concluded that they are, in some essential way, no longer the beings they were before biotransference. That something vital was lost in the transformation from flesh to metal. The Space Marine in his sarcophagus faces a similar question from a different angle. He retains his organic brain, the biological component that the Necrons discarded entirely. But his existence has become so divorced from normal biological life that the distinction may be meaningless. He breathes amniotic fluid instead of air. His senses are entirely mechanical. His body, what remains of it, serves no function except as a housing for the brain and gene seed. In what sense can he be said to be still the being he was before his interment? The technomancer activates a deep scan, one that maps the neural patterns within the Space Marine's brain. This is delicate work, requiring sensors calibrated to detect the subtle electromagnetic patterns of organic nervous systems. What he discovers is a mind that has been modified far beyond baseline human capacity. The Space Marine's brain shows signs of surgical alteration. Additional organs and glands integrated into the structure, neural pathways enhanced and rewired to support enhanced cognition and reaction times. But overlaying all of this enhancement is damage. Sections of the brain show signs of degradation, neurons dying and connections weakening as the years of suspended animation take their toll. The life support systems can maintain the basic functions necessary for survival, can keep the brain alive, but they cannot prevent the slow decay that comes from existing in such an unnatural state for such extended periods. The Space Marine is dying, has been dying slowly for centuries, though the process is so gradual that he might continue to function for centuries more before critical systems fail entirely. This observation raises a practical question. The Dreadnought is damaged. Its systems degraded by whatever catastrophe brought it to this tomb, and by the years spent inactive in the deep earth. If nothing is done, it will eventually fail completely. The power reactor will exhaust its fuel. The life support systems will malfunction beyond their ability to self-repair. The pilot will die, and this fascinating example of the younger races' approach to consciousness preservation will be lost. The technomancer finds himself considering options that would never have occurred to him before this discovery. He could repair the Dreadnought. With his understanding of universal principles of engineering and access to the tomb's fabrication facilities, restoring the war machine to full functionality would be trivial. The difficult part would be understanding the systems well enough to maintain compatibility with the organic pilot. But even that represents merely a technical challenge rather than a fundamental impossibility. But why would he consider such action? The practical technomancer argues against it. This is an intruder, a foreign object in the sacred tomb. It should be disassembled and studied. Its components analyzed to better understand the capabilities and limitations of the younger races. The pilot himself could provide valuable intelligence about the Imperium, about space marine capabilities and tactics, if he could be awakened and interrogated. Yet another part of the Technomancer's consciousness, the part that remembers what it was like to be Necronter, to be truly alive and curious about the universe, sees value in preservation. This Dreadnought represents something rare in the galaxy, a genuine parallel to the Necrons' own existence. Studying it could provide insights, not just into the younger race's technology, but into the fundamental questions about consciousness and identity that the Necrons have struggled with for 60 million years. The Technomancer extends his senses through the Toon's network, accessing the vast libraries of information accumulated over millions of years. He searches for any reference to similar technology, any previous encounter with devices that preserve organic life in mechanical shells. The search returns nothing of value. The ancient databases contain extensive information about the civilizations the Necronter encountered during their expansion. But none of them had developed this particular approach to extending life. The old ones and their creations relied on psyker abilities and warp manipulation. Other races simply accepted mortality or, like the Necronter themselves, sought technological transcendence. This Space Marine Dreadnought, then, represents something new. A solution to the problem of mortality that the ancient Necrons never encountered, developed by a race that had not even existed when the tombs were sealed. The novelty alone makes it worthy of preservation and study. But there are political considerations that complicate the decision. The Technomancer serves, at least nominally, the tomb's overlord, currently still in stasis. Any significant decision should be referred up the hierarchy. Yet awakening the overlord for something that might prove to be merely a curiosity could be seen as wasting the noble's time and the tome's power reserves. Cryptics occupy a strange position in Necron society, technically servants without official rank, but in practice possessing enormous influence because of their irreplaceable expertise. The Technomancer considers his options carefully. He could handle this entire situation himself, making decisions about the Dreadnought's fate without consulting higher authority. This has certain appeal, allowing him to pursue whatever course of study or experimentation his curiosity suggests without interference. But it also carries risks. If the Overlord awakens later and discovers that significant events occurred without his knowledge or approval, his anger could be considerable. Alternatively, the Technomancer could awaken the Overlord now, presenting the discovery and allowing the noble to make decisions about its disposition. This shows proper respect for hierarchy, but surrenders control over what happens to this fascinating find. Overlords can be unpredictable. Their decision-making colored by the fading memories of their Necronter existence and the accumulated grudges and obsessions of millions of years. The Overlord might order the Dreadnought destroyed out of general xenophobia, or claim it as a trophy, or make any number of other decisions that would prevent proper study. There is a third option, more subtle and politically complex. The Technomancer could awaken the Overlord, while simultaneously framing the discovery in ways that encourage specific responses. Present the Dreadnought as a potential threat, and the Overlord will likely order its destruction. Present it as a curiosity worthy of study, and the Overlord might grant permission for extensive analysis. Present it as a potential source of intelligence about the younger races, and the Overlord might decide to attempt communication with the pilot. The Technomancer understands the manipulation of nobles through careful presentation of information. It is a skill every cryptic must develop to survive the Byzantine politics of Necron courts. But using that skill requires him to decide first what outcome he actually desires, what he wants to do with this discovery. The honest answer, he realizes, is that he wants to understand. He wants to delve into every system of this machine, to analyze every component of the life support apparatus, to map every neural pathway in the Space Marine's enhanced brain. He wants to know how it works, how it compares to Necron technology, what insights it might provide into alternative approaches to the problem of consciousness preservation. He wants, in short, to satisfy the scientific curiosity that once drove the cryptic conclaves before they fragmented and isolated themselves during the Great Sleep. But beyond mere understanding, there is something else. A strange kinship that the technomancer feels with the being suspended in the sarcophagus. Both of them exist in states that mock natural life. Both have been transformed by technology into something that can no longer properly be called organic. Both serve purposes that extend far beyond their own individual existence. Trapped in roles they cannot escape even if they wished to. The Space Marine in his Dreadnought is not so different from a Necron in his living metal shell. Both are prisoners of duty, consciousness preserved past all reasonable limits in service to causes larger than themselves. The Space Marine serves his Emperor and his chapter. The Necron serves his dynasty and his people. Both have sacrificed everything that makes life worth living in exchange for the ability to continue serving. This realization brings the technomancer to a decision. He will preserve the Dreadnought, at least for now. He will repair it, study it, and possibly even attempt to communicate with its pilot. But he will do this carefully, with full awareness of the political and practical complications. He will awaken the Overlord, but frame the discovery in ways that support his desired outcome. And he will see where this investigation leads, following the trail of discovery wherever it might take him. The technomancer begins issuing commands to the canoptech constructs around him. They move with renewed purpose, responding to his directives. Scarabs swarm over the Dreadnought's surface, but instead of disassembling it, they begin the delicate work of repair. They seal the breaches in the armor, restore damaged systems, clear accumulated dust and corrosion from joints and sensors. The canoptech spider positions itself nearby, ready to fabricate replacement components as needed under the technomancer's direction. Meanwhile, the technomancer accesses the tome's communication systems, preparing the signal that will begin the Overlord's awakening. The message he crafts is carefully worded, presenting the Dreadnought as a significant discovery worthy of the noble's attention, without revealing just how fascinated the technomancer himself has become. He describes it as advanced technology from a younger race, a potential source of intelligence about the current state of the galaxy, and an intrusion that requires the Overlord's judgment regarding proper disposition. The message is sent, traveling through the tomb's systems to the stasis crypt where the Overlord has slept for uncounted millennia. The awakening process begins, far slower than the technomancer's own had been. Overlords are too valuable to risk rushing their revival. Power flows carefully, systems check and recheck themselves, and slowly, the noble begins his return to consciousness. While he waits, the technomancer continues his work on the Dreadnought. Each new discovery adds to his understanding. Each repair brings the machine closer to full functionality. He estimates that within a few solar cycles, the Dreadnought will be restored to operational status. The pilot inside will still sleep, his awakening dependent on systems that the technomancer does not yet fully understand and is reluctant to trigger without more knowledge. But the machine itself will be ready, its weapons charged, its sensors active, its massive form standing sentinel in the tome's depths. What will happen when Overlord and Dreadnought meet face to face? That remains to be seen. But the technomancer feels something he has not experienced in millions of years. Anticipation. For once, the future holds genuine uncertainty, a problem whose solution cannot be calculated from first principles or found in ancient databases. Whatever comes next will be new, and in a life that has stretched across 60 million years of existence, novelty is precious beyond measure. The court awakens. The Overlord's awakening is a ceremony of sorts, even with no one present to witness it, but automated systems and the omnipresent gaze of the tome mind. Power flows through conduits that have waited dormant for ages, each surge carefully controlled to prevent damage to delicate systems. The stasis crypt that holds the noble's form is far more sophisticated than those of lesser Necrons, fitted with additional safeguards and redundancies befitting his rank. Inside the crypt, the Overlord's consciousness begins its long journey back from the timeless void. For him, as for all Necrons, there is no sense of time passing during stasis. No dreams mark the difference between a year and a million years. There is simply the moment of entering sleep, and then, without transition, the moment of awakening. Yet even in this instant transition, there is a quality of wrongness that never quite fades, no matter how many times the cycle repeats. The first thing the Overlord experiences is sensory data returning. His optical sensors begin feeding information to his consciousness. Though at first all they show is the interior of the crypt, familiar surfaces he has seen countless times before. Audio receptors activate, picking up the hum of power systems and the faint skittering of canoptek scarabs going about their maintenance duties. Tactical systems come online, updating him on the status of the tomb, its power reserves, defensive posture, the location and status of other Necrons. And then comes the message from the Technomancer, waiting in his communication buffer like a gift or a curse depending on one's perspective. The Overlord processes the information, his consciousness fully active now even as his body remains within the crypt. An intrusion, foreign technology, a potential intelligence source. The Technomancer's words are carefully neutral, presenting facts without recommendation, leaving the decision to the Overlord, as is proper. The Overlord considers this information while running diagnostics on his own systems. Everything reports functioning within acceptable parameters, though he notes the degradation that always accumulates during long stasis. His consciousness matrix has lost some clarity. Certain memories, already fading before he entered sleep, have degraded further. He tries to recall the name of a particular rival from the court on Mandragora, a cryptech whose mastery of geomancy had nearly cost the Overlord his position in a long-ago dispute, and finds that the name has slipped away entirely. Only the sense of ancient grudge remains, details eroded by the passage of time and the inherent instability of consciousness transferred into metal. No matter. What matters now is the present situation, the intrusion that has disturbed his rest. The Overlord commands the crypt to open, and with a whisper of ancient mechanisms, the sarcophagus unseals, living metal flows aside, and the Overlord rises to his feet, experiencing once again the strange sensation of having a body after the complete sensory deprivation of stasis. He is taller than a human, his necrodermis form possessing proportions that suggest nobility even to those unfamiliar with Necron hierarchy. His body bears the marks of his rank, intricate engravings that tell the story of his dynasty in glyphs few living beings could now read, ornamental features that serve no purpose but to declare his status, the subtle differences in design that separate nobles from the masses. His optical sensors glow with particular intensity, burning with a light that might be called proud, if such emotional terms could still apply to beings of living metal. The Overlord strides from the crypts into the deeper chambers of the tomb, canoptek constructs parting before him in recognition of his authority. The Tom Mind provides constant updates on his position and the locations of other active systems, creating a mental map of the tome's current state. He notes with approval that the Technomancer has taken appropriate precautions, establishing a perimeter around the intrusion and beginning preliminary analysis without making irreversible decisions. When he arrives at the chamber where the Dreadnought rests, the Overlord stops, studying the scene before him with sensors that can perceive across multiple spectra. The Technomancer stands near the war machine, canoptek scarabs swarming across its surface in organized patterns. The Dreadnought itself dominates the chamber, massive and solid, its battered armor showing signs of conflicts long past. Emergency lighting activated by the Technomancer's presence casts shadows that emphasize the mechanical nature of both observers and observed. Technomancer. The Overlord's voice crackles with the particular timbre that marks him as nobility, a subtle difference in the way his vocalizer synthesizes speech that any Necron would immediately recognize. You have disturbed my rest for this. The Technomancer turns, bowing with the exact degree of deference appropriate to his station and the Overlord's rank. Politics in Necron courts is a precise art, and failures of protocol can have consequences that last for millennia. My lord, I deemed this discovery significant enough to warrant your attention. This device represents technology we have not encountered previously. employing principles that may provide valuable intelligence regarding the younger race's capabilities. The Overlord circles the Dreadnought slowly, his sensors active and analyzing. The Technomancer has prepared well, data files ready for transmission containing all the information his investigation has gathered. The Overlord accepts these files, processing them in parallel with his own observations, building a comprehensive understanding of what stands before him. A war machine, the Overlord says after a long moment of analysis. Crude in construction, primitive in execution, but showing a certain brutal efficiency in design. The younger races have progressed somewhat since last we walked among them. Indeed, my lord. But there is more. The Technomancer highlights specific portions of the data, drawing attention to the sarcophagus and its contents. The machine contains a living being, preserved in a state that bears certain similarities to our own existence. This captures the Overlord's attention fully. He focuses his sensors on the sarcophagus, performing scans that penetrate armor and fluid to reveal the space marine within. For a long moment, he is silent, processing what he observes. "It is an abomination," he says finally, but there is something in his synthesized voice that suggests this is not the complete sum of his reaction. "They have taken flesh and encased it in metal, creating a mockery of our own transcendence. This being is neither properly alive nor appropriately dead. It exists in some liminal state, trapped between the two." "Yes, my lord." And yet, the Technomancer hesitates, aware that he approaches dangerous philosophical territory. "Is our own state so different? We traded flesh for metal, yes, but in doing so we created our own liminal existence. We are not the Necronter we were, but neither are we purely machines. This being has made a different choice, or had the choice made for it, but the underlying principle is familiar." The Overlord's optical sensors flare, bright enough to cast visible light across the chamber. For a moment, the Technomancer wonders if he has overstepped, if his comment will be taken as impertinence requiring punishment. But then the light dims again, and when the Overlord speaks, his voice carries an edge that might be bitter amusement. "You philosophize, Technomancer. It is unbecoming. But I will permit it given the circumstances." He moves closer to the Dreadnought, one metal hand reaching out to touch its armor. "You are correct, of course. There are parallels between this being's state and our own. We are all prisoners of duty, slaves to choices made long ago or by others on our behalf. The only question is what we do with that reality." The Overlord pulls his hand back, turning to face the Technomancer directly. "What is your recommendation? You would not have awakened me without some thought about how this situation should be handled." The Technomancer has prepared for this question, has planned his response carefully. "My lord, I believe we have several options. We could destroy the device, eliminating a potential threat and ensuring the sanctity of the tome is restored. We could study it extensively, gaining intelligence about the younger races, technology, and capabilities. Or we could attempt to communicate with the being inside, learning what it might tell us about the current state of the galaxy. Each option has merits, the Overlord acknowledges, and each has costs or risks. Destruction is simple, but wastes the opportunity this represents. Study without communication limits our understanding. Communication carries the risk that the being might escape and reveal our presence here. Tell me, Technomancer, which option do you favor?" It is a test, the Technomancer realizes. The Overlord knows that cryptics always have preferences, always have agendas. He is inviting the Technomancer to declare his openly, rather than pursuing them through subtle manipulation. It is almost refreshing, this directness, though it carries its own dangers. "I favor extensive study, my lord, followed by limited communication under carefully controlled circumstances. This device represents a unique opportunity to understand how the younger races approach the problem of mortality and consciousness preservation. The intelligence we might gain could prove valuable if our dynasty decides to engage with the current galactic powers." The Overlord considers this, his consciousness processing possibilities and outcomes. "And you believe the knowledge is worth the risk?" "I do, my lord. But the decision is yours to make." "Indeed it is." The Overlord falls silent, his senses still fixed on the Dreadnought. When he speaks again, it is not with a direct answer but with a question. How long has it been, do you think, since this being was interred in its mechanical shell? The Technomancer consults his analysis. Based on the wear patterns and degradation signatures, I estimate between 500 and 1,000 years by their reckoning. 500 years. The Overlord's voice carries something that might be contemplation. A mere blink. I have been in stasis for thousands of times that span. Yet this being has spent those centuries in the same service, fighting their battles, sleeping between conflicts, existing in a state that cannot properly be called life. And they name this an honor. They present it as a reward for service, rather than the curse it clearly is. My lord, I am thinking, Technomancer, about the lies we tell ourselves. The Necrons were promised immortality, eternal life free from the cancers that plagued us. What we received was existence without end, consciousness without purpose, an eternity of service to causes that matter less with each passing age. We tell ourselves this was worth the price, that we made the correct choice. But late at night, when the tomb is silent and there is no one to witness, I wonder if the old ones did us a greater kindness by refusing our request for immortality. The Technomancer remains silent. These are dangerous thoughts, the kind that leads to the madness that has claimed so many Necrons over the millions of years. But they are also honest thoughts. And honesty is rare enough among their kind to be precious. The Overlord seems to shake himself from his reverie. But that is philosophical indulgence we cannot afford. This being in its prison may not have our span of years, but it faces the same fundamental question we do. What is the point of continued existence when existence has become divorced from all that makes it meaningful? He turns to face the Technomancer fully. Here is my decision. You will study this device and the being within it thoroughly. I want to know everything there is to know about its construction, its capabilities, and the organism it contains. But you will not communicate with the pilot, not yet. First, we must understand what we face. Only then can we decide if dialogue is possible or advisable, and if the being awakens during our studies. Then you will sedate it again, using whatever means prove necessary. The Canoptech constructs can learn to interface with its systems well enough to control its state of consciousness. Do not let it wake until we are ready to face the questions its awakening would pose. It will be done, my lord. The Overlord nods, then gestures to encompass the tomb around them. I will not return to stasis yet. This discovery suggests that the galaxy above has changed in ways we should investigate. Awaken a small force. Warriors and immortals sufficient to scout the surface and determine what has become of this world during our sleep. I would know what threatens or surrounds us before we commit to any course of action regarding this intrusion. As you command. The Technomancer bows again, acknowledging the orders, but before he can turn to implement them, the Overlord speaks once more. Technomancer, you were wise to awaken me for this. The implications go beyond simple intrusion or threat assessment. This being in its shell, it is a mirror held up to our own existence. Perhaps studying it will help us understand what we ourselves have become. Or perhaps it will only deepen the questions that have no answers. Either way, knowledge is preferable to ignorance. With that, the Overlord departs, his footsteps echoing through the ancient corridors as he makes his way to the command chambers to oversee the broader awakening. The Technomancer is left alone with the Dreadnought and the swarms of Canoptech constructs that continue their work under his direction. He looks up at the war machine, at the sarcophagus that holds its sleeping pilot, and allows himself a moment of genuine curiosity, unmarred by practical considerations. What will they discover in their study of this device? What secrets does it hold about the nature of consciousness and the price of service? And when the time comes to awaken the space marine within, what will that being make of finding himself surrounded by creatures who understand his plight better than any living thing in the galaxy possibly could? These are questions without immediate answers, but the Technomancer finds that he looks forward to pursuing them. After millions of years of existence, A new problem to solve is a gift beyond measure. And if that problem comes wrapped in philosophical quandaries and political complications, well, that simply makes it more interesting. The work begins in earnest, methodical and thorough. The tomb, silent for so long, hums with renewed activity as the Overlord's commands ripple through its systems. Warriors awaken in their ranks. Immortals begin the process of revival. Canoptech constructs swarm to prepare equipment and vehicles. The tomb lives again, if that word can apply to beings who have transcended life itself. And at the heart of it all, the Dreadnought stands silent, its pilot lost in dreamless sleep, unaware that he has become the center of a drama whose implications he could never imagine. Two forms of immortality face each other, across the divide of consciousness and metal, and what they will make of each other when full understanding finally comes remains to be seen. The spectrum of possible fates, with the Overlord's commands given and the Technomancer's investigation beginning in earnest. We can now explore the various outcomes that might result from this unprecedented encounter. The fate of the sleeping Space Marine depends on numerous factors. The specific personality and priorities of the Necron noble who commands the tomb, the dynasty's current strategic situation, the broader political context within the Necron Empire, and the simple luck of whether cooler heads prevail over xenophobic impulse. Let us examine 4 possible scenarios, each representing a different path this situation might take. Scenario 1, the prize of knowledge. In this outcome, scientific curiosity wins the day. The Technomancer, with the Overlord's support, commits to an exhaustive study of the Dreadnought and its pilot. The investigation that follows would be methodical and invasive, but not necessarily cruel in any intentional sense. The Necrons simply pursue knowledge with the same ruthless efficiency they bring to all endeavors. The Dreadnought would be carefully disassembled, each component studied in isolation before being returned to its place. The Technomancer would create detailed schematics of every system, from the gross mechanical components down to the molecular structure of materials. He would map the fusion reactor's design, understanding its fuel cycle and energy conversion efficiency. He would trace every circuit and connection in the neural interface, building a complete picture of how the Space Marine's consciousness integrates with the machine. The sarcophagus itself would receive particular attention. The Technomancer would analyze the amniotic fluid's composition, determining exactly which chemicals serve which purposes and how they interact with organic tissue. He would study the life support systems, understanding their redundancies and fail-safes. He would map every tube and cable that connects the pilot to the machine, creating a complete picture of how biology and technology merge in this hybrid existence. And then there is the pilot himself. Here the study becomes more ethically troubling. Though the Necrons would not see it that way, they have long since abandoned such organic concepts as rights or dignity. To them, the Space Marine is simply another subject of study, his consciousness no more sacred than any other pattern of electrical activity in organic neurons. The Technomancer would perform non-invasive scans first, mapping the Space Marine's brain structure in exquisite detail. He would trace neural pathways, identifying areas of enhancement where the Space Marine's transformation process added new capabilities. He would measure electrical activity, building patterns of the pilot's resting state that could be compared to active states if he were ever awakened. But passive observation only reveals so much. To truly understand the Space Marine's consciousness, the Technomancer would need to interact with it more directly. This might involve inducing specific brain states through electromagnetic stimulation, triggering responses that reveal how different areas of the brain interact. It might mean carefully adjusting the levels of various neurotransmitters through the life support system, observing how this affects neural activity patterns. In essence, the Technomancer would experiment on the sleeping Space Marine, testing the limits and properties of his consciousness without waking him. Each experiment would be carefully controlled and documented, building toward a complete understanding of how this being's mind functions and how it differs from both baseline human consciousness and the Necron's own artificial intelligence. The knowledge gained from this study would be considerable. The Necrons would learn the current state of Imperial technology in the field of cybernetic integration. They would understand the Space Marines' approach to preserving warriors beyond the limits of flesh. They might even gain insights applicable to their own condition, understanding from the outside perspective what it means to have consciousness depend on machines for continued existence. But what of the Space Marine himself? In this scenario, he might remain in stasis throughout the entire process, never waking to discover his fate. When the Technomancer finishes his studies, the Dreadnought would be reassembled perfectly. Every component returned to its exact place. To outside examination, it would appear unchanged, though the Technomancer's understanding of its workings would be complete. Then would come the decision point. What to do with the Dreadnought now that it has yielded its secrets? One option would be preservation. The tomb could maintain the Dreadnought indefinitely, keeping it as a specimen for future reference or as a trophy demonstrating the dynasty's encounter with the younger races. The Space Marine would continue his sleep, unaware that he has become an exhibit in a Xenos museum millions of years older than his chapter. Alternatively, the Overlord might decide to release the Dreadnought. The war machine could be transported to the surface and left where it might eventually be discovered by its own kind. The Space Marine would wake, finally, to find himself rescued by his chapter or the Imperium, never knowing what had studied him in the depths. The gaps in his memory could be attributed to his time in stasis, a common enough occurrence for Dreadnoughts that no one would question it. Or, in a darker variant, the Dreadnought might be destroyed once it has served its purpose. Not out of malice, but simply because the Necrons see no value in maintaining a potential threat once knowledge has been extracted. The Space Marine would die in his sleep, never knowing that he had been the subject of examination by beings who understood his plight better than he ever could. Scenario 2. The weapon unmade in this outcome. Security concerns override curiosity. The Overlord, after reviewing the Technomancer's initial findings, concludes that the Dreadnought represents an unacceptable risk to the tomb's security and should be eliminated. From the Overlord's perspective, this is the most pragmatic choice. The Dreadnought is a weapon designed for war and still potentially functional despite its damage. It carries within it a Space Marine, a warrior of the Imperium whose entire existence is dedicated to the destruction of Xenos threats. Even in its damaged state, it could potentially cause considerable destruction if it awakened and went on a rampage within the tomb's corridors. Moreover, the Dreadnought's presence is an unknown. How did it arrive here? Is it a scout for a larger force? Does its chapter know its location and plan to retrieve it? The answers to these questions are unclear, and in the absence of clear answers, the safest course is elimination. The Technomancer might argue against this decision, pointing out the knowledge that would be lost. But ultimately, the choice rests with the Overlord, and if he decides that security trumps curiosity, the cryptic must comply. The destruction would be methodical and thorough. The Dreadnought would not be simply smashed or blown apart. Instead, it would be disassembled carefully, each component separated, and analyzed before being destroyed. The goal would be to ensure that nothing remains that could be recovered and studied by the Imperium or any other faction. The weapons would be removed first, their power cells drained and their mechanisms rendered inert. Then the armor plating would be stripped away, revealing the internal systems beneath. Each system would be catalogued as it was destroyed, ensuring that the Necrons at least gained some understanding of Imperial technology, even as they eliminated the threat. Finally, there would be the sarcophagus and its occupant. Here, the destruction becomes more troubling to contemplate. The life support systems would be shut down systematically, each fail-safe overridden, each backup disabled. The Space Marine would die in his sleep, his consciousness fading as oxygen ceased to flow and his brain began to fail. Would he wake during this process? Would there be a moment of awareness, of understanding that death had finally come? Or would the transition be so gradual that consciousness never returned, the Space Marines sliding from artificial sleep into genuine death without ever knowing the difference. Either way, once the organic component had expired, the sarcophagus itself would be destroyed. The amniotic fluid would be drained and neutralized. The metal shell would be melted down or disintegrated. The neural interface cables would be rendered into their component atoms. Nothing would remain to suggest that a Space Marine had ever been here. The canoptek scarabs would be thorough in their cleanup, consuming every trace of organic matter, every bit of metal that might carry identifying marks. When they finished, the chamber where the Dreadnought had rested would be pristine, showing no sign that anything unusual had ever occurred there. And the tomb would return to sleep, its inhabitants satisfied that they had eliminated a potential threat. The Space Marines chapter might search for their lost Ancient One, might wonder at his fate, but they would find nothing. One more Dreadnought lost to the ages. One more warrior whose final fate would remain forever unknown. This outcome is the darkest in many ways, because it represents the utter meaninglessness of the Space Marine's end. He would die alone in the dark, never knowing that he had been found and studied and judged insufficient to preserve. His service, his sacrifice, the centuries or millennia he spent as a Dreadnought. All of it would end in anonymous oblivion at the hands of beings who saw him as nothing more than a potential problem to be solved through application of superior technology. Scenario 3. The Awakening. In the third scenario, the Overlord decides that the most valuable information would come from direct communication with the Space Marine. This carries risks, certainly, but it also offers opportunities that no amount of passive study could provide. The being inside the sarcophagus has knowledge, experiences, and perspectives that could prove invaluable. The preparation for this awakening would be extensive. The Necrons would first ensure that they had complete control over the Dreadnought's systems. They would create override codes for its weapons, ensuring that the Space Marine could not attack, even if he wished to. They would establish monitoring of his neural patterns, ready to induce unconsciousness again if he became too agitated or dangerous. The chamber where the awakening occurred would be prepared carefully. The Dreadnought would be physically restrained, held in position by fields of force or mechanical clamps that could withstand even its considerable strength. Weapons would be positioned to destroy it instantly if something went wrong. And the Overlord himself would be present, possibly with guards, ready to face whatever might come. Then would come the moment of activation. The Technomancer would carefully trigger the Dreadnought's awakening protocols, bringing its systems online in the proper sequence. The fusion reactor would power up, energy flowing to weapons and sensors and the life support systems. Inside the sarcophagus, chemical balances would shift. Hormones and neurotransmitters flooding the Space Marine's brain to pull him from the depths of stasis sleep. The transition from unconsciousness to awareness would be gradual for the pilot. First would come basic sensation, the feeling of amniotic fluid in his lungs, the pressure of neural interface cables against his spine. Then would come awareness of the Dreadnought itself, the familiar sensation of being once again connected to the war machine's sensors and systems. But something would be immediately wrong. The visual feed would show nothing familiar. No tech marines preparing him for deployment, no chaplain delivering prayers for victory. Instead, his optical sensors would show a chamber of alien design. Walls that gleam with the particular sheen of living metal, lights that burn with green witch, fire rather than the honest orange glow of Imperial tech. And standing before him, visible in his targeting systems, but unlike any enemy he has faced before, would be the Necrons. Skeletal forms of living metal, their optical sensors burning with cold intelligence. Weapons at the ready, but not yet raised in threat. The Space Marine's first instinct might be to attack. Decades or centuries of conditioning have prepared him to respond to threats with overwhelming force. His targeting systems would lock onto the nearest Necron, calculations running automatically to determine optimal firing solutions. His weapons would begin their power-up sequence, preparing to unleash destruction on these Xenos who have dared to disturb his rest. But the weapons would not respond. the Necrons' override codes would hold, preventing activation regardless of how frantically the Space Marine's mind tries to command them. He would find himself paralyzed, trapped in a body that will not obey, facing enemies he cannot fight. The psychological impact would be tremendous. Space Marines are conditioned to be in control, to dominate any situation through superior strength and firepower. To be helpless, particularly in the face of Xeno's threats, would violate everything in the warrior's training and experience. It is at this moment that the Overlord would speak, his voice crackling through the Dreadnought's audio receptors with the synthesized tones of Necron vocalizers. What he says would depend on his personality and goals, but it might begin with something simple. Space Marine, you are in no danger if you remain calm. We have questions for you, and we would prefer to obtain answers through dialogue rather than force. The Space Marine's response would be impossible to predict with certainty. Some might maintain disciplined silence, refusing to give the Xenos the satisfaction of response. Others might demand explanations, asking where they are and what has been done to them. Still others might simply curse their captors, venting rage at being taken by the enemy. The Overlord would allow this initial response, studying the Space Marines' reactions and learning from them. Then he would begin his interrogation, asking questions designed to gather intelligence about the current state of the galaxy, about the Imperium and its capabilities, about the Space Marines and their chapters. But alongside these practical questions would come others, more philosophical in nature. The Overlord would want to understand how the Space Marine views his own existence, how he feels about his transformation into a Dreadnought, whether he truly believes the lies his chapter tells about honor and service. And here the interrogation might take an unexpected turn, because the Necrons and the Dreadnought pilot have more in common than either might initially realize. Both exist in states that mock natural life. Both have been transformed by technology into something that cannot truly be called alive or dead. Both serve purposes that extend far beyond their individual desires or needs. If the conversation progresses far enough, if the Overlord is skilled enough in his questioning, and the Space Marine open enough in his responses, they might actually find common ground. Not friendship, certainly, and not alliance, but perhaps a mutual recognition of the costs they have each paid for their respective forms of immortality. The Space Marine might speak of the isolation he feels, the way his memories fade with each cycle of sleep and waking, the growing certainty that he is becoming less human with each passing century. The Overlord might, in turn, speak of the Necrons' own struggles, the degradation of consciousness over millions of years, the question of whether they can still be considered the beings they were before biotransference. This exchange would be valuable to both sides, though neither might admit it openly. The Space Marine would gain perspective on his own condition, understanding that others face similar struggles, even if from different origins. The Overlord would gain insight into how the younger races approach the problem of mortality and the preservation of consciousness beyond the limits of flesh. But eventually, the conversation would reach its natural end. The Space Marine would have said what he is willing to say. The Overlord would have gathered the intelligence he sought. And then would come the decision about what to do with the prisoner. Keeping him would be impractical and dangerous. Even with control over his weapon systems, the Dreadnought represents a potential threat. His chapter might come looking for him. His presence could complicate the dynasty's relations with the Imperium. Better to resolve the situation one way or another. The merciful choice would be release. The Dreadnought could be transported to the surface, perhaps with his memory of the encounter erased or at least clouded. He would awaken in some remote location, recovered but uncertain of what happened during his time in the depths. His chapter would eventually find him, and he would return to service, carrying only the vague sense that something significant occurred that he can no longer quite remember. The practical choice would be execution. A quick end, at least, more merciful than the slow decay that awaits all Dreadnoughts who serve long enough. The Space Marine's consciousness would be extinguished, his sarcophagus destroyed, his secret sealed forever. Which choice the Overlord would make depends on his personality and situation. A pragmatic noble might choose execution, eliminating risk. A more curious or philosophical Overlord might choose release, respecting in some way the courage the Space Marine showed in facing his captors. Either way, the encounter would end, leaving both sides changed by the experience in ways they might not fully understand. Scenario 4. The unholy union, the final scenario we will consider, is perhaps the most disturbing from a certain perspective, though it offers possibilities the others do not. In this outcome, the Technomancer convinces the Overlord that the Dreadnought represents not just a subject of study or a prisoner to be interrogated, but an opportunity to create something new. The Cryptics have spent millions of years perfecting their understanding of technology and its application. They can manipulate matter at fundamental levels, creating devices that seem like magic to less advanced races. What if, the Technomancer suggests, they could apply this expertise to the Dreadnought? What if they could improve upon the crude Imperial design, creating something that combines Necron sophistication with the unique properties of the Space Marine pilot? The Overlord's initial response might be rejection. Why waste resources improving the technology of the younger races? But the Technomancer would argue that this is not about helping the Imperium. It is about understanding, about testing the limits of what is possible when Necron science meets Imperial engineering. Moreover, there might be practical applications. A Dreadnought enhanced with Necron technology could serve as an agent of the dynasty, operating in ways that pure Necron forces could not. It would be deniable, untraceable to the dynasty if something went wrong, and it would provide a test case for future experiments in combining organic and inorganic components in new ways. If the Overlord agrees to this proposal, the work that follows would be extensive and invasive. The Technomancer would begin by making small improvements, replacing damaged components with Necron equivalents that function better and require less maintenance. The fusion reactor might be replaced with a more efficient Necron power source. The armor could be reinforced with living metal, granting it the self-repair capabilities that make Necron constructs so difficult to destroy permanently. But the real work would focus on the interface between the Space Marine and the machine. The crude neural cables of Imperial design would be replaced with Necron equivalents that offer better bandwidth and more precise control. The sarcophagus itself might be redesigned, incorporating Necron life support technology that could maintain the organic components indefinitely without degradation. And then there are the weapons. Imperial armaments are effective but limited by the technology available to the Imperium. Necron weapons, by contrast, operate on principles the Imperium does not understand and cannot replicate. What if the Dreadnought were equipped with Gauss flayers or particle casters, instead of assault cannons and heavy bolters? What kind of destruction could such a hybrid create? Through all of this work, the Space Marine himself might remain conscious or might be kept sedated, depending on the Technomancer's needs and the Overlord's preferences. If kept awake, the Marine would experience the transformation of his body-machine, feeling systems he has known for centuries, replaced with alien equivalents, his capabilities expanding in ways he never imagined possible. The psychological impact would be profound. The Space Marine is conditioned to hate and fear Xenos, to see their technology as corrupt and heretical, yet hear that technology is being integrated into his very being, making him stronger, more capable, more deadly than any Dreadnought of his chapter has ever been. How would he reconcile his enhanced abilities with his fundamental beliefs about the superiority of human technology and the Emperor's protection? When the work was complete, the result would be something unprecedented. A Space Marine Dreadnought rebuilt according to Necron principles, possessing capabilities far beyond any Imperial equivalent. It would be faster, stronger, more durable. Its weapons would be more powerful. Its systems would be more reliable. In every measurable way, it would be superior to what it had been before. But what would be the cost? The Space Marine might find that the changes go deeper than mere hardware. Necron technology operates according to principles that blur the line between organic and inorganic, between consciousness and computation. The enhanced neural interface might begin to affect the Space Marine's thought patterns, making him think in ways that are subtly more like the Necrons and less like his former brothers. The dynasty might find uses for their enhanced creation. The Dreadnought could be sent on missions that pure Necron forces could not accomplish, operating in human space without immediately alerting the Imperium to the Necrons' presence. It could gather intelligence, eliminate threats, or simply sow chaos among the younger races while maintaining deniability for the dynasty. Or the Overlord might simply release the enhanced Dreadnought, sending it back to its chapter to see what happens. Would the Space Marines accept their ancient one back, even in his changed state? Would they recognize the Xenos modifications and condemn him as tainted? Or would they simply be grateful to have their brother returned, ignoring questions about how he was changed in favor of celebrating his recovery? This scenario raises troubling questions about identity and modification. At what point does enhancement become corruption? When is technology improvement, and when does it represent a violation of the being enhanced? The Space Marine might become more capable through Necron intervention, but has he also become less himself? Are the changes purely mechanical, or do they affect the fundamental nature of his consciousness and identity? These questions have no easy answers, which is precisely what makes this scenario so disturbing and fascinating. The boundary between improvement and violation, between enhancement and corruption, is not always clear. And in the grim darkness of the far future, such ambiguity can be more terrifying than any simple threat. The mirror of mortality, regardless of which scenario unfolds. The encounter between Necron and Dreadnought forces, both sides to confront uncomfortable truths about their own existence. The parallels between these two forms of manufactured immortality are too obvious to ignore, even for beings who would prefer not to acknowledge them. Consider the Necrons first. They are beings who have existed for 60 million years in bodies of living metal. Their consciousness patterns impressed into mechanical substrates through the process of biotransference. They chose this transformation, or at least their leaders chose it for them, trading the cancer-ridden flesh of the Necronter for the promise of eternal life. But the cost of that bargain has become clear over the millions of years since. The Necrons are not the beings they were before biotransference. The process of transferring consciousness from organic neurons to mechanical circuits inevitably changes that consciousness. Memories fade. Personalities erode. The connection to the biological drives and emotional responses that once motivated them gradually weakens, until some Necrons exist as little more than automatons going through the motions of existence without truly experiencing it. The nobles, those who retained enough consciousness to still possess something like personality, struggle with questions that have no satisfying answers. What are they now? Are they still the Necronter, who made the choice to undergo biotransference? Or are they something else? Machines running programs that were once alive? When does the degradation of consciousness become so severe that continuity of identity breaks down entirely? Many Necrons have concluded, through millions of years of existence, that they made a terrible mistake. The Silent King himself, leader of the Serkon dynasty and supreme authority of the Necron race, chose self-imposed exile after the war in heaven, partly because of his guilt over leading his people into biotransference. He wandered the intergalactic void for millions of years, contemplating the price his people paid for their supposed immortality. But acknowledging the mistake does not undo it. The Necrons cannot return to organic life. The techniques and knowledge required to reverse biotransference, if they ever existed, were lost in the chaos of the war in heaven and the destruction of the Titan who performed the original transformation. The Necrons are locked into their current existence, unable to go back, uncertain about moving forward, simply persisting because that is what they do. Now consider the Space Marine in his Dreadnought. He too has been transformed, his broken body encased in a mechanical shell that allows him to continue serving despite injuries that should have killed him. like the Necrons. He exists in a state between life and death, his consciousness preserved through technology long past the point where nature would have claimed him. But unlike the Necrons, the Space Marine did not choose this fate, at least not in any meaningful sense. When a Space Marine is interred in a Dreadnought, he is typically unconscious from his wounds, unable to consent to or refuse the process. The decision is made by his chapter's leadership, by tech Marines and chaplains who judge him worthy of the honor of continued service. He awakens already transformed, already committed to a path he cannot escape. The Space Marine is told this is an honor, the highest reward his chapter can offer for exceptional service, and in a sense it is. To be chosen for interment is to be deemed so valuable that the chapter will expend enormous resources to preserve you. It is to be recognized as a hero, whose skills and experience are too precious to lose. It is to be promised eternal service in the Emperor's name, fighting forever for humanity's survival. But honor and horror are not mutually exclusive. The Space Marine's existence as a Dreadnought is profoundly unnatural. He breathes amniotic fluid instead of air. His senses are entirely mechanical. His body, what remains of it, serves no function except as a housing for his brain and gene seed. He cannot move without the Dreadnought, cannot see or hear or speak except through its systems. He is more thoroughly imprisoned than any criminal in any jail, confined to a space barely larger than a coffin, with no possibility of parole or escape. And like the Necrons, the Space Marine experiences degradation over time. The cycles of sleep and waking take their toll on his organic brain. Neural connections weaken, memories fade, personality changes as the human components of his consciousness slowly fail, despite the best efforts of the life support systems. Eventually, if he serves long enough, he will degrade to the point where he is barely more than an automaton piloting his war machine through pure instinct rather than conscious thought. The parallels between Necron and Dreadnought become unavoidable when you examine them closely. Both exist in states that cannot properly be called life, but equally cannot be called death. Both serve purposes that extend far beyond their individual desires or needs. Both have had choices made for them by others, commitments imposed that they cannot escape even if they wish to. Both face the slow erosion of consciousness over time, the gradual loss of what makes them who they are. Even the sleep they experience is similar in many ways. The Necron's stasis is a complete cessation of consciousness, a void without dreams or sense of time passing. The Dreadnought's sleep, while achieved through different means, produces similar results. Both wake with no sense of how long they have slept, time compressed to nothing by the absence of conscious experience. Both find that their memories of previous wakings have faded, events blurring together in ways that make it difficult to maintain a clear sense of timeline or identity. The key difference lies in scale. The Necrons have endured their existence for 60 million years. They have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, seen stars born and die, watched the galaxy transform beyond recognition multiple times over. They have had millions of years to contemplate the meaning or meaninglessness of their existence, to question the choices that led them here, to struggle with the implications of immortality without purpose. The Space Marine, by contrast, has existed in his state for at most a few thousand years, more typically a few centuries. His perspective is limited to a single slice of galactic history. His experience confined to the conflicts of the first Millennium. He has not had millions of years to contemplate his condition. But that does not mean he has not reached similar conclusions about the nature of his existence and the costs it has exacted. When the Overlord looks at the sleeping Dreadnought, he sees a reflection of his own condition. Here is another being trapped in a technological shell, preserved beyond all natural limits, existing primarily as a weapon rather than a person. The differences in detail are vast, but the fundamental situation is eerily familiar. It is like looking into a distorted mirror and seeing not what you are, but what you might have been if different choices had been made. This recognition creates a complex emotional response, if Necrons can still be said to experience emotions in any conventional sense. There is a certain kinship, a recognition of shared experience, even across the vast gulf of biology and culture that separates the Imperium from the Necron dynasties. But there is also something else, a kind of dark validation. If even the younger races, in their primitive stumbling toward technological sophistication, have concluded that preserving consciousness in mechanical shells is worthwhile, does that suggest the Necrons made the right choice after all? Or does it simply mean that both civilizations have made the same fundamental mistake, choosing the illusion of immortality over the acceptance of natural mortality? That they have both looked into the abyss of death and chosen, instead, a kind of living death that mocks everything that makes existence meaningful. The Technomancer, studying the Dreadnought with his scientific detachment, might find these questions troubling even as he pursues his investigation. He wants to understand the Imperial technology, to map its workings and limitations. But understanding the mechanism does not answer the deeper questions about whether such technology should exist at all, whether its application represents progress or a fundamental violation of the natural order. For the Space Marine, if he ever awakens to find himself in Necron custody, the encounter would force similar reflections. He has probably never questioned his existence as a Dreadnought before, never had reason to see it as anything other than honored service. But confronted by beings who represent an even more extreme version of technological transformation, who have traveled further down the road from flesh to metal than any Dreadnought has or could, he might begin to wonder. Are the Necrons a warning of what happens when the pursuit of immortality is taken to its logical extreme? Or are they simply further along the same path the Imperium has started down, showing what the future might hold if current trends continue? When the Space Marine looks at the skeletal form of living metal that stands before him, does he see an alien enemy, or does he see a possible future version of himself? Consciousness preserved for millions of years in a body that has long since ceased to be anything that could be called alive. These questions would remain largely unanswered, because neither side has definitive answers to offer. The Necrons have 60 million years of experience with their condition, but that experience has not resolved the fundamental ambiguities about what they have become. The Space Marine has his faith in the Emperor and his chapter's teachings about honor and duty, but those beliefs have never had to confront a mirror that reflects back the costs of the choices made on his behalf. What both sides might realize, if the conversation goes deep enough, is that they are both prisoners. The Necron is imprisoned by his transformation into living metal, unable to return to organic life, locked into serving his dynasty for as long as consciousness persists. The Space Marine is imprisoned by his Dreadnought shell, unable to leave or live without it, committed to fighting until destruction finally ends his service. Neither chose their fate freely. The Necrons were manipulated into biotransference by the Titan and their own desperate leaders. The Space Marine had his choice made for him by others when he was too wounded to consent or refuse. Both are told their transformation was an honor, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Both might wonder, in their darkest moments, whether honor is simply the name given to prisons that their captors want them to accept willingly. In the end, the encounter between Necron and Dreadnought is significant, not because of any immediate practical consequences, but because of the questions it forces both sides to confront. Questions about consciousness and identity, about the costs of technological immortality, about whether existence can be meaningful when divorced from everything that makes life worth living. These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps they are not questions with answers at all. But they are questions worth asking, even in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, because in that darkness, understanding what we have become and what we have sacrificed to become it is one of the few remaining forms of wisdom available to beings who have outlived their own mortality. Final thoughts: the scenario we have explored of a Necron tomb discovering a sleeping Space Marine Dreadnought represents a collision between two of the 41st millennium's most tragic examples of technological immortality. It is a situation that, while unlikely given the specific circumstances required to bring it about, is not impossible in a galaxy as vast and chaotic as the one in which Warhammer 40k is set. We have examined the nature of both Dreadnoughts and Necron tomb worlds, understanding the technologies and philosophies that underlie each. We have considered the mechanisms by which a Dreadnought might end up deep within a Necron tomb, bypassing the defenses and alarms through circumstance rather than intent. We have witnessed the discovery of this intrusion through the eyes of Canoptech constructs and the technomancer they summon to investigate. We have observed the awakening of the Overlord and his deliberations about how to handle this unprecedented situation. And we have explored 4 possible outcomes, each representing a different path the encounter might take: preservation and study, destruction and elimination, communication and interrogation, or enhancement and transformation. Each outcome reflects different priorities and different conclusions about the value or threat the Dreadnought represents. But beyond these practical considerations, we have delved into the philosophical implications of this meeting. The parallels between Necron and Dreadnought, between 2 forms of consciousness preserved in mechanical shells, force uncomfortable questions about the nature of existence and the costs of immortality. Both beings exist in states that mock natural life while avoiding true death. Both serve purposes that extend far beyond their individual will or desire. Both face the slow erosion of self over time, degrading through the very processes that keep them functioning. The grim darkness of the far future is filled with horrors beyond count, with wars that span star systems and weapons that can destroy planets. But some of the greatest horrors are not the obvious ones, not the alien monsters or the daemonic entities or the genocidal forces. Some of the greatest horrors are the subtle ones, the slow realizations about the costs exacted by the technologies and ideologies that promise salvation or transcendence. The Necrons thought they had won when they achieved immortality through biotransference. They thought they had escaped the cancers that plagued their flesh and the death that claimed all organic beings. Only after millions of years did they realize the price of their victory, the ways in which they had lost themselves in the process of trying to preserve themselves. The Space Marines interred as Dreadnoughts are told they have been honored, chosen for eternal service because of their exceptional worth. They are promised continued glory, fighting for the Emperor and their chapter long after their flesh has failed. Only gradually, over the centuries of sleep and brief awakenings, do they realize the nature of the cage they have been placed in, the ways in which their existence has become divorced from everything that might make it meaningful. The encounter between these 2 forms of manufactured immortality should prompt us to consider what we are willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of continued existence. Is consciousness without the possibility of growth or change truly worth preserving? Is service without choice or end truly honorable? At what point does the cure become worse than the disease, the solution more problematic than the problem it was meant to solve? These are not questions with simple answers. The Necrons might argue that even their degraded existence is preferable to the oblivion of death, that consciousness in any form is better than the alternative. The Space Marines might insist that service to the Emperor justifies any sacrifice, that the honor of continued battle outweighs the costs of Dreadnought existence. But both arguments ring somewhat hollow when examined closely. Both are justifications constructed after the fact to make bearable choices that cannot be undone. Both are stories we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the full implications of what we have become and what we have lost in the becoming. In the chamber deep beneath the earth, surrounded by technology beyond human understanding, the sleeping Space Marine represents a question mark in the calculations of an ancient alien civilization. He is proof that the problems the Necrons face are not unique to them, that other races grapple with similar issues, even if from different starting points and with different implementations. He is a mirror that reflects back uncomfortable truths about the nature of technological immortality and the costs it exacts on consciousness. Whether he wakes to discover his captors, or sleeps through his examination, or dies without ever knowing he was found. The Space Marine's presence in the tomb has already had an impact. He has forced questions, created doubts, reminded beings who have existed for 60 million years that they are not the only ones struggling with the implications of transcending mortality through technology. And perhaps, in some small way, that is enough. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, even small acknowledgements of shared struggle matter. Even brief moments of recognition across the gulf of species and ideology have value. Even the questions without answers serve a purpose by forcing us to confront what we might prefer to ignore. The tomb will continue to sleep, its inhabitants drifting through their timeless void until the next alarm calls them to wakefulness. The Dreadnought, whether preserved or destroyed or released or enhanced, will eventually meet whatever fate the Necrons decide for it. The galaxy will continue its endless cycles of conflict and destruction, caring nothing for the philosophical questions raised by one unusual encounter in the depths of a forgotten world. But for those who pause to consider this scenario, who think deeply about what it means when two forms of manufactured immortality meet, there is value in the contemplation. There are lessons to be learned about the costs of technology, the nature of consciousness, and the ways in which our attempts to transcend our limitations can sometimes create new and more terrible limitations instead. In the end, both the Necron and the Dreadnought are monuments to the same fundamental truth: immortality without purpose is just another form of death, and consciousness without the possibility of growth or change is just a particularly elaborate form of imprisonment. They exist not as warnings, because their civilizations lack the wisdom to heed warnings, but as examples of what happens when the pursuit of life beyond death is taken to its logical conclusion. And in the dark chambers beneath unnamed worlds, in the silence broken only by the hum of ancient machinery, these examples wait. They sleep and wake and sleep again, measuring eternity in the spaces between battles, existing because they know no other way to be. If you enjoyed this exploration into one of Warhammer 40,000's most unsettling scenarios, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless dark corners of this universe still to explore, countless questions about what happens when the galaxy's factions collide in unexpected ways. Your support helps make more of these deep dives possible. Until next time, may your service be honorable, your sleep be peaceful, and may you never wake to find yourself in the custody of beings who see your existence as nothing more than an interesting curiosity to be studied and then discarded. For there is only war in the darkness between the stars, and in that war, some fates are worse than death.